This video is for educational purposes only, not medical advice. Always consult your doctor before making any dietary or lifestyle changes. In the book of Judges, Samson kills a young lion with his bare hands on the road to Timnah. Sometime later, he passes the carcass again and finds a swarm of bees has built a hive inside it and honey along with them. He reaches in, eats it, and later turns the whole strange discovery into a riddle for his wedding guests. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. That's not folklore. That's a specific, written story about where one of the most important sweeteners in the ancient world actually came from, found in the wild, in the strangest of places, centuries before anyone had ever refined a single grain of sugar. By the end of this video, you'll understand why honey, not sugar, was the sweetener mentioned throughout the Bible more than almost any other food, and one simple swap that brings it back into your own kitchen. If you're new here, subscribe to Ancestral Fix. Every week, we find what the ancient world knew and what your body still needs. Stay with me. Dorothy has kept the same white sugar bowl on her counter for as long as she can remember. A spoonful in her coffee, a spoonful over her morning oatmeal, exactly the way her mother did it, and her mother before her. She's never once questioned it. It's just sugar, it's just what goes in the bowl. What Dorothy doesn't know is that the sweetener people relied on for most of human history, the one Samson found in that lion, the one mentioned throughout the Bible more than almost any other food, isn't sitting in her cabinet at all. It's the one thing she'd have to drive to a farmer's market to find. Let's start with what's actually in Dorothy's sugar bowl. Refined white sugar is a relatively recent invention in the scope of human history. Large-scale sugar refining, the kind that produces the pure white crystals in nearly every American kitchen, only became widespread and affordable in the last 200 to 300 years, growing dramatically once industrial processing made it cheap to produce at massive scale. Before that, sweetening food was a very different matter entirely. Samson's riddle is just one story among many. The phrase, "a land flowing with milk and honey," appears throughout the Old Testament as the defining description of the promised land itself, used again and again in the book of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. John the Baptist survives in the wilderness on locusts and wild honey in the Gospel of Matthew. The book of Proverbs advises more than once that honey is good to eat, but should be eaten in moderation, lest you have too much and become sick of it. Practical grandmotherly advice about a food that mattered enough to write down. Honey wasn't a treat in the ancient world. For thousands of years, before refined sugar existed anywhere, it was essentially the only concentrated sweetener most people ever had access to. Archaeologists have found honey remains in Egyptian tombs, still perfectly preserved after thousands of years, because honey kept properly doesn't spoil. So if honey was that central for that long, what happened to it? Why is Dorothy's bowl full of something else entirely? That's where this gets interesting. Once industrial sugar refining made cheap, shelf-stable white sugar available to everyone, honey slowly stopped being a household necessity and became more of an occasional specialty item, something for a cup of tea or a recipe calling for it specifically, rather than the everyday sweetener sitting in the bowl on the counter. Dorothy's sugar bowl is really a habit that's only a few generations old, even though it feels as permanent and traditional as anything in her kitchen. Her grandmother's grandmother would have found it strange. Here's the part that doesn't get explained clearly, and it's the whole reason this swap matters. Refined white sugar is pure sucrose, stripped of everything else it might have once carried, processed specifically to be as neutral and characterless as possible so it performs identically in every recipe. Raw, unfiltered honey, by contrast, is never judged sugar. It carries small amounts of enzymes, antioxidant compounds, and trace minerals that vary depending on which flowers the bees visited, along with tiny amounts of pollen. None of that makes honey a health food you should eat freely. It is still a concentrated sugar, and your body processes it as such. But it does mean honey and refined white sugar aren't quite the nutritional blank slates people often assume they are. There's a practical difference too, one Dorothy would notice the very first time she tried it. Honey is sweeter than sugar by volume, which means recipes generally need less of it to achieve the same sweetness. It also behaves differently in baking, adding moisture and a deeper, more complex flavor that plain white sugar simply can't provide, since it is designed to taste like nothing at all beyond pure sweetness. Ever wonder why sugar tastes exactly the same no matter which bag you buy? That's not an accident. That sameness is the entire point of refining it, and it is also exactly what gets lost along the way. Let's move into why this matters more specifically after 60. Blood sugar management tends to become a more careful balancing act as we age. And while honey is still sugar and still affects blood glucose, some research has looked at whether honey's slightly different composition, including its fructose to glucose ratio and trace compounds, produces a somewhat different blood sugar response compared to an equivalent amount of refined white sugar. The research here is genuinely mixed and still developing, and honey is not a free pass for anyone managing diabetes or blood sugar closely. That's exactly the kind of specific guidance worth getting from your doctor rather than a video. What we can say more confidently is that honey brings a small amount of nutritional complexity that pure refined sugar simply doesn't have, for whatever that's worth, in an otherwise balanced diet. Now, before you picture Dorothy dumping spoonfuls of honey into her coffee with total abandon, that's not what this is about. Honey is still a concentrated sugar, and calorie for calorie, it's not meaningfully different from table sugar in terms of overall intake. What we're talking about here is a direct substitution in the foods where Dorothy already reaches for sugar anyway, choosing an older, less processed version of the same sweetness rather than adding more sweetness to her day overall. So how would this actually work in daily life? Picture Dorothy trying it for the first time tomorrow morning. The simplest starting point is a one-to-one swap by taste rather than exact measurement, since honey is sweeter than sugar. Start with about 3/4 the amount of honey compared to whatever sugar a recipe or your morning coffee calls for, and adjust from there based on your own taste. In baking, since honey adds moisture, it helps to reduce other liquids in the recipe slightly and lower the oven temperature by about 25 degrees, since honey-sweetened baked goods tend to brown faster. For coffee, tea, or oatmeal, it's simply a direct swap, a spoonful of honey where a spoonful of sugar used to go. Raw, unfiltered honey, the cloudy kind rather than the perfectly clear bottled variety, is generally your best option, since heavy filtering and pasteurization remove much of what makes honey different from plain sugar in the first place. Local honey from a farmer's market or a beekeeper near you is often raw by default, and supports a local producer at the same time. One thing worth mentioning clearly: honey should never be given to infants under 1 year old due to a small but real risk of infant botulism from bacterial spores that an adult's digestive system handles without issue, but a baby's cannot yet. This doesn't apply to older children or adults, but it's an important distinction. If you have young grandchildren around, there's something almost fitting about the fact that Dorothy's sugar bowl, something that feels as old and unchangeable as anything in her kitchen, is actually one of the newest habits in her entire routine, newer than her furniture, her recipes, probably newer than most of what's on her spice rack. And the thing it quietly replaced had been sitting in kitchens, mentioned in scripture, described as one of the defining features of a promised land for thousands of years, before anyone thought to strip it down into something purer and blanker. If Dorothy swapped that bowl for a jar tomorrow, her coffee would taste different before she even finished her first sip. Not necessarily better to everyone, but richer, and a little closer to something her family had actually been eating for most of history, before a bowl of white crystals quietly took its place a few generations back. Now, if you've spent years hearing that all sugar, in any form, should simply be avoided as you get older, this next part is worth sitting with. The core advice to limit added sugar overall remains sound and worth taking seriously, and honey doesn't change that basic guidance. But there's a difference between minimizing added sugar as a category and treating every source of sweetness as chemically identical. Honey, used thoughtfully and in the same modest amounts sugar would have been used anyway, isn't a health food, but it isn't simply interchangeable with refined sugar either. And for anyone managing a health condition where the distinction matters, it's worth a specific conversation with your doctor rather than a general assumption either way. This is really the same quiet theme running through so much of what we cover on this channel. It's rarely about a single ingredient being purely good or purely bad. It's about noticing which version of something old got quietly swapped out for something newer and more processed, often without anyone deciding that on purpose. It just became the default because it was cheaper and easier to produce at scale. Let's come back to where we started. A white sugar bowl that feels like it's always been there, sitting on a counter, in a kitchen, in a habit that's really only a few generations deep, and a jar of something much older, mentioned throughout Scripture as a sign of abundance that never actually disappeared. It just stopped being the thing people reached for automatically. Once something cheaper and blanker came along to take its place. If there's one thing to take from today, let it be this. Sometimes the oldest sweetness in the room has been quietly waiting in a jar at the farmer's market the whole time, while the newer habit sat right there on the counter, looking like it had always belonged. This video is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. Always consult your doctor before making dietary changes, especially if you are managing diabetes or blood sugar levels. Honey should never be given to children under 1 year of age. If this kind of gentle, ancestral wisdom speaks to you, consider subscribing, because next time we're looking at a weapon the Byzantine Empire used for 800 years that was so effective and so secret, the formula disappeared when the empire fell. We'd love to have you along.